Is the West, you can define it however you wish, losing its cultural influence as well as its economic dominance? So with the turning in of some societies and US no longer the beacon that it was, the shining city on the hill perhaps, some argue that the West is losing its influence and not just economically. To kick us off, Cindy.
Wow, it was a very big question, and I'm afraid can only talk about it from the Chinese perspective, because I think for us sitting in the West, talking about the decline of the West, especially the decline of Western cultural influence, it's very hard to say because we don't see how the rest of the world sees the West. Hollywood, going back to Hollywood, remains a massive force, at least in China. But I don't know how much it's declined in recent years in other countries. So I have to say, setting out from the caveat, what China sees. What's interesting, and going back to my previous point about hubris, is that in recent decades in China, you might think this is a good thing or a bad thing, the Chinese have become more confident in their own cultural exports. So what do I mean by that? I mean that when we talk about luxury fashion, so for example in the 90s you might have Chinese people coming out looking for Chanel and Burberry. Today's millennials and Generation Zs, they love Chinese brands and they don't care about chasing the same Western soft power labels that their parents did. And that's a fascinating development. And you might think, it's only fashion, but actually it betrays a deeper cultural confidence in itself. China hasn't really had cultural confidence in itself in the last couple of centuries. It's been going through a lot of stuff. And so, you end up with phrases like 崇洋媚外, loving the West in favor of the Chinese. But I see that turning on its head now, and luxury fashion is an example. In recent years, the highest grossing films in China have all been Chinese with the exception of Avengers Endgame. So, some things do cut through. But what's interesting is that as China rises, its own cultural exports are becoming more what it looks for as well. And Linda, I know you wanted me to touch on ways in which China's doing well as well around the world. So, things like Belt and Road Initiative we talked about, and of course Peter is right that a lot of these debt traps leave countries in not very good positions, and we've heard about Sri Lankan ports being, carved out and all this sort of stuff. But it's also the case that a lot of these recipients of Belt and Road Initiative funding are not countries that the West is interested in. So when was the last time that the UK did anything with Pakistan in terms of investment? So when was the last time that the UK cared anything about Africa? Earlier this year we had a debate about the foreign aid budget cut. So it looks as if in a lot of these places where perhaps because of the fall of colonialism and imperialism, the West is withdrawing into itself, with the exception of tackling Islamic extremism perhaps, whereas China is looking to go into all of these places, like Morocco, like Sub-Saharan Africa, like Southeast Asia, and giving them vaccines, giving them investments. And that is one way in which China is exporting its influence. But the question is about cultural influence, and this is the interesting point. I don't think it is exporting its cultural influence except in cultures that are already quite similar to itself. So in South Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, there's a lot of consumption of Chinese soft power. But outside of that, it's not this case that Mandarin, for example, has become the language that everyone seeks to speak. I don't know if any of you have even heard of Chinese pop music, and certainly in a lot of parts of the world, that's not an export at all. So, to go back to the question, I don't think, when it comes to cultural influence, in China, the West is losing its cultural influence in favor of a more confident Chinese cultural native export. But that doesn't mean China is doing any better in itself in exporting its own in other parts of the world, with the exception of hard power, investments, roads, infrastructure, vaccines, that sort of stuff. And, even that has, as Peter has pointed out, mixed success.
Thank you, Cindy. I want to come to Peter back on these issues, but Phil, let me bring you in. It sounds like what Cindy is arguing is that from the Chinese perspective, they're looking more to their own cultures. That is a relative decline of Western culture. But what is your take on this?
Yeah, that's true. And there's an obvious economic reason for that. And it's interesting you mentioned Chanel, Cindy, because I've always thought Coco Chanel is not given the credit she deserves in diplomatic circles for being a major political figure. And the reason I think that is that the Chanel company were very serious collaborators with the Nazis. They did their work by essentially being complicit with National Socialist Germany. But then the Chanel products were a very, very important part of what glittered in the windows in Berlin during the Cold War. And that consumerism was a very important part of it. The cultural artifacts, though, were the embodiment of an economic disparity. They were the ways in which you could see visibly that on this side of the wall there was prosperity, and on this side of the wall there were queues. Now that's not true now. We've got a rival economic system to the Western liberal democratic capitalist system, which on its own terms is doing very well. That's the fundamental difference. So you can have the cultural confidence in the knowledge that you can pay for it, you can fund it. So that's the central question. I hesitate to be too deterministic about it, but it takes you back to the economic success. And so long as that China is able to continue its economic success, whilst also denying its people the political liberties which are the usual accompaniment of economic success, then it can have a cultural confidence. If that compact breaks down, then it won't.
I got to get your reply to that, Cindy, before we come to Peter.
No, I think Phil's right, and I think cultural exports have a lasting impact after economic advantage goes. So it's, I guess I'm not a classicist, so people might correct me on this, but you can see the influence of the Greeks on the Roman Empire even after Greece had become a region to be administered by the Roman Empire. So I think these cultural artifacts, and even in the British Empire, the soft power that we wield in America is not corresponding really to our economic advantage at the moment. So the question is, how long does that last? And I think China is at its very peaks. There's an interesting question which we might come on to later about how much China will continue to grow, how much its growth is sustainable, especially in this week's Evergrande, the property estate agents, which is maybe defaulting in China. So the question is that a Karelian for China, or is that a Lehman Brothers for China? So how sustainable is this economic growth? And if it doesn't quite make it, and this goes to my point of hubris, if the Chinese get overconfident before they make it to superpowerdom, what does that mean? And I think that's a very interesting situation to be in.
Peter.
One of the conundrums that we face is that China is ostensibly communist in name, but essentially a state-controlled capitalism in reality. So you could say that even in China, the Western model has triumphed. In China today, there are nearly 400 billionaires, I think almost as many as the United States. There are huge disparities between rich and poor. You've got the immense riches of the major cities, and still in the more rural areas, people are being forced off their land to make way for new cities and motorways with bare compensation. So you have this incredible contradiction between what China claims to be and what it actually is. And what has been very interesting has been the revival of a new form of Maoism in parts of China to counter these huge disparities in wealth and power, and the increasing repression of nascent independent trade unions in China as well, where labor activists have sought to challenge harsh working conditions, lack of health and safety, low wages and so on, and been very heavily repressed. To look at what the West is doing that is good and which has some potential to maintain cultural influence, and I would say not that I'm advocating the West, but I'm advocating liberal progressive values, which of course are shared by people in all countries and all cultures. If we look at some of our development aid, some of it is tied to exports and has an ulterior motive, but some of it is genuinely linked to NGOs doing great work to provide clean water, sanitation, farming implements for poor communities. That is a very positive way in which Western or liberal values are being maintained or exported or encouraged in other countries. We also have great institutions like the BBC, one of the most trusted news services in the world, which many, many millions of people around the world tune into to circumvent the state control and censorship of their own media. We have the great work of the British Council, which promotes cultural debates and discussions in many countries. I'm not saying these are perfect by a long shot, but on the whole, they are a force for good. And then we have football. Football in this country has been a great, I suppose, internationalizer. Something, you've got people all over the world who follow British football teams. And
even in China.
Yeah, and football is a great leveler. It brings people together and transcends political, economic, and cultural differences. There is the fact that the English language is the most universal in the world, and again, a great unifying factor. And of course, this can be used for bad as well as for good. But I think the cultural influence of Western countries is still there, and it is still significant. And so therefore, I would very much caution against, albeit the rise of Islamism and right-wing populism, I would very much caution against the idea that the West is losing out culturally. We are not as influential as we once were, and that is probably a good thing, although not in terms of those negative alternative movements.
Thank you, Peter. I think
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.